We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish.
Gaudium magnum, habemus papam. Eminentissimum ac reverendissimum Dominum Georgium Marium, Sancte Romani Ecclesiae Cardinalem Bergoglio, qui sibi nomen imposuit Franciscum.
Reaction in Argentina to the election of one of their own as Pope has sparked a divergence of opinion. While mainly positive, among some it's revived a polemic about the role of the Roman Catholic Church during the country's so-called Dirty War. But the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo are more critical of the former cardinal. They're campaigning for justice for their children who disappeared during the military dictatorship in the 70s and early 80s. The church in Argentina was giving communion to the assassins, and the assassins should repent. Ours didn't repent, not even during their trials. He was nominated bishop at the time, and as a bishop he could have done more.
Bush, the grandfather of George W. Bush, and George Herbert Walker, his maternal great-grandfather for whom his daddy is named, were Nazi traitors to the country who should have been tried for treason. Union Banking Corporation. In actuality, it was anything but a bank. It was essentially a Nazi money laundering operation that had a lot of tentacles into a lot of different other businesses. Incredibly, after being warned by the FBI and the Justice Department and the Treasury Department to cease and desist in their Nazi dealings, they had continued them until 1951. There had been 28 additional seizures of Nazi assets and Nazi business fronts between late 1942 and 1951, and that they had moved Nazi assets into Switzerland, Brazil, Argentina, 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 Argentina.
A German U-boat pulls into a foreign port, not in Japan or Spain, but in the South American nation of Argentina. Argentina's Juan Perón is an open admirer of Hitler's regime, and the country is already home to many powerful Nazis. In the coming years, many more will arrive, including the wanted war criminals Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the death camps, and Joseph Mengele, dubbed Auschwitz's Doctor of Death.
Argentina tenía el dudoso privilegio de albergar el partido nazi más importante del mundo fuera de Alemania.
In Argentina, all the conditions were right to accept Nazi war criminals.
Perón muy hábilmente consideraba que era un deshonor llevar a juicio a un ejército derrotado.
En el caso de Mengele, el laboratorio Fabro-Farm lo incorporó como parte de su plantel.
Que lo encontró un equipo de la televisión de Estados Unidos.
En el caso de Eichmann, los israelíes no iban a actuar por derecha y decidieron el secuestro directamente.
¿Qué mejor que un país hospitalario?
ביצע הוצאות להורג, גירש למחנות ריכוז, שם נרצחו.
60 years, this is how long it took Nazi hunters to track down Ivo Rojnica, a Croatian officer, another who said he was just following orders as he oversaw the cleansing of Jews and Serbs in Croatia.
Se lo acusa de haber provocado incitación a matanza.
Despite his denial, these documents show exactly what the 91-year-old man ordered done back in 1941 in Dubrovnik, Croatia, as a senior officer in the Ostashi, a fascist organization subordinated to the Nazis.
Se prohíbe a todos los judíos y serbios libre movimiento por las calles.
This officer was on a mission of the SS, didn't only restrict the people's movement.
Mentirle a la gente serbia y judía de que los va a ayudar a trasladarse a Italia. Entonces con ese cuento los metía en un barco sin saber qué pasó con ellos.
A wave of Nazi criminals washed South America after the war. Some of the fugitive killers arrived with the shelter of dictator Juan Perón to Argentina to the Bariloche village. Others, like Rojnica, preferred Buenos Aires. The Croatian criminal may be feared of revenge, but didn't really went out of his way to hide. He built a classic European house just 300 meters away from the president's house. But Rojnica is wrong. The score isn't settled. After numerous setbacks, the hunters in the Wiesenthal Center, who have watched him all these years, believe Serbia will submit under pressure and demand his extradition. Now, the man in charge of cleansing Dubrovnik will finally face charges, and will find out that the stain in his past cannot be erased.
not you would run in 2016. Some people say that obviously you're very proud of your family and proud of their accomplishments, but the question is, would it be a political burden? I think it's fair to say that when your brother left the presidency, he was somewhat unpopular. Do you think that there is any Bush baggage? Do you think that would be a problem?
No, I don't think there's any Bush baggage at all. I am proud to be a Bush, and if I run for president, it's not because of something in my DNA that compels me to do it. It would be that it's the right thing to do for my family, that the conditions are right, and that I have something to offer. And that decision will happen, as I said, later on.
March the 24th, 1976, a military junta headed by General Videla overthrew Argentina's democratically elected government and launched a campaign of terror against all who opposed the coup.
De Dios, quisiera demostrar sobre esta tierra de cuánto es capaz el ejército argentino cuando lucha por la libertad, la paz y la justicia para su pueblo.
In the years that followed, 15,000 people were executed and 30,000 disappeared. 250 concentration camps were set up throughout Argentina, where so-called terrorists were routinely and systematically tortured while being interrogated. A mere wall separated detainees who were blindfolded and tortured from the seemingly normal life of passers-by. Thousands of people accused of terrorism were illegally detained, tortured and killed within these walls. The Argentine armed forces were trained in torture from the 1960s. These torture training sessions were sometimes photographed by those taking part in them. 33 years after the fall of the military regime, only one torturer is in jail.
"30 years after the end of the Argentinian Dirty War, the children of the disappeared were still searching. "30,000 people disappeared in the Dirty War. Among them were 500 pregnant women who gave birth in captivity, then were killed. Their babies are now 30 and struggling to discover who they are."
Ernesto Seman, who is a historian at New York University, former reporter for the Argentine newspaper, both the same as Horacio's newspaper, Página 12, and Clarín, where he reported on politics and human rights, as well as, well, Father Bergoglio, now Pope Francis.
For more on the new Pope, we turn now to one of Argentina's leading investigative journalists, Horacio Verbitsky, who has written extensively about the career of Cardinal Bergoglio and his actions during the military dictatorship that ruled Argentina from 1976 to 1983. During that time, up to 30,000 people were kidnapped and killed. A 2005 lawsuit accused Jorge Bergoglio of being connected to the 1976 kidnappings of two Jesuit priests, Orlando Llorio and Francisco Jalix. The lawsuit was filed after the publication of Verbitsky's book, The Silence, From Paul VI to Bergoglio, The Secret Relations Between the Church and the ESMA. ESMA refers to the former Navy school that was turned into a detention center where people were tortured by the military dictatorship. The new Pope has denied denied the charges. He twice invoked his right under Argentine law to refuse to appear in open court to testify about the allegations. When he eventually did testify in 2010, human rights activists characterized his answers as evasive. In the case of Bergoglio, there's also the issue, as you have documented, and several other journalists in Argentina, of his particular role or accusations about his involvement in the dirty wars in Argentina. Could you talk about that and some of the things that, because you've been a leading investigative reporter uncovering the relations between the church and the government in terms of the dirty wars?
Of course. He was accused by two Jesuit priests of having surrendered them to the military. They were a group of Jesuits that were under Bergoglio's direction. He was the provincial superior of the order in Argentina. 36 years he was provincial. During a period of great political activity in the Jesus Company, he stimulated the social work of the Jesuits, but when the military coup overthrew the Isabel Perón government, he was in touch with the military that ousted this government and asked the Jesuits to stop their social work. And when they refused to do it, he stopped protecting them, and he let the military know that they were not more inside the protection of the Jesus Company, and they were kidnapped. The president founding of CELS, Center for Legal and Social Studies, Emilio Mignone, said that Bergoglio was accomplice of the military. This priest has links with subversion. That was the name that the military gave to all the people involved in opposition to the government, political or armed opposition to the military, and that he was jailed in the mechanic school of the Navy, and saying that this information was provided to the officer by Father Jorge Mario Bergoglio, provincial superior of the Jesuit Company. This means, to my understanding, a double standard. He asked the passport given to the priest in a formal note with his signature, but under the table he said the opposite and repeated the accusations that produced the kidnapping of this priest. After his releasing, went to Rome.
How were they found?
Sorry?
How were they found? In what condition were they? What had happened to them?
Well, he was released, both of them were released dragged, confused, transported by helicopter to in the outskirts of Buenos Aires, were abandoned as left by a drag in very bad condition. They were tortured, they were interrogated. One of the interrogators had extraordinary knowings about theological questions that induced one of them, Orlando Llorio, to think that the own provincial Bergoglio has been involved in this interrogatory.
He said that Bergoglio himself had been part of his own interrogation, this Jesuit priest?
He told me that he had the impression that the own provincial Bergoglio was present during the interrogatory, in which one of the interrogators had extraordinary knowledge of theological questions. And Orlando Llorio denounced Bergoglio. I received his testimony when Bergoglio was elected to the Archbishop of Buenos Aires. And Bergoglio, I interviewed Bergoglio also, and he denied the charges, and he told me that he had defended them. And Orlando Jorio got me in touch with Francisco Jalix, that was living in Germany. I talked with him, and he confirmed the story that he was during a lot of years very resented against Bergoglio, but that he had decided to forget and forget.
Horacio Verbitsky, I'd like to ask you about another priest who was involved in the dirty wars, Christian von Wernick, who was a former chaplain of the police department in Argentina, and also later was convicted of being involved.
He was convicted. He's in jail, in a common jail. But the Argentine church, during the tenure of Bergoglio, hasn't punished him in canonical terms. He was convicted by the human justice, but by the church standards, he is always a priest. And this tells something about Bergoglio and the Argentine church also.
And von Wernick was involved in murders, tortures, and kidnappings. Could you detail some of the crimes that he was convicted of committing?
Bergoglio involved in the crimes of von Wernick?
No, von Wernick, I said.
Well, von Wernick was active part in torture and killings, and he was convicted not as an accomplice, but as a participant in the crimes. He was present during the torture sessions from Wernick. And there is not just one chaplain. There are some others that are under trial in this moment. Chaplain Regueiro is under house arrest because he's an older man. Chaplain Citelli in Santa Fe province, for being present during torture sessions. So there are a lot of them that were part of the dirty war.
I wanted to read, Horacio, a part of the State Department cable released by WikiLeaks that references, the Roman Catholic priest Christian von Wernick, who you were just talking about, convicted in 2007 of being an accomplice in several cases of murder, torture, and illegal imprisonment in Argentina during the military dictatorship. It notes the conviction came, quote, at a time when some observers consider Roman Catholic Primate Cardinal Bergoglio to be a leader of the opposition to the Kirchner administration because of his comments about social issues. The von Wernick case could also have the effect, some believe, of undermining the church's and by extension Cardinal Bergoglio's moral authority or capacity to comment on political, social, or economic questions, unquote. That was a State Department cable that was released by WikiLeaks. Horacio, could you respond?
We can go as Jack the Stripper by parts. First of all, the State Department considered that Bergoglio was the chief of the opposition to the Kirchner government, and I agree with this statement.
Bergoglio from Argentina. Cardinal Bergoglio, newly elected Pope, leader of the Roman Catholic Church. I wanted to bring in Father Matt Malone, who is in Rome now, and I'd like to get your reaction, Father Malone, to the announcement of the new Pope. And I would like to, we'll get to Father Malone in just a moment, but Father Guthrie, your reaction.
I am here.
Your reaction. Cardinal Bergoglio been elevated to the pontificate.
Well, this was not one of the names that was listed as if it was going to be an early election. I think I'm a surprise, I think, yes.
Jesuit, and I must tell you, I never expected in a million years that a Jesuit would step out as Pope.
What does that say to the larger picture, to the direction of the Catholic Church? some of the background. He was born in 1936, ordained as a priest for the Jesuit community, as you had pointed out, Father, in 1969, and that in of itself is a surprise. Father Malone, if you could, speak to the fact that a Jesuit has now been elevated to the pontificate.
Well, it's an extraordinary thing. He is the first Jesuit in the history of the Roman Catholic Church to be elected Pope. And without getting into the history of the Jesuits formed in the 16th century, we've had a stormy relationship with the Church in some centuries, and it's really an extraordinary thing.
Insofar as there has been a tension between some aspects of the Vatican and the Jesuits, and I think having a Jesuit as Pope, and in view of the fact that the Jesuits have been so worldwide in their activity, in their missionary activity, and their teaching in the Church, so that I think it would be interpreted as a sign of, rather than making a selection for someone who's closer to the Opus Dei or some much more conservative movement.
Now joining us to discuss the significance of the choice of this Pope is Matthew Fox. Matthew's written 30 books on spirituality and culture, including The Pope's War. And he was once a Catholic priest, and he is now an Episcopal priest and educator. Thanks very much for joining us, Matthew.
Thank you, Paul. It's sentimentalized by the media, and there's very little critical thinking, and that's one reason I'm glad to be with you, and we can talk about the deeper meanings. Of course, the financial situation in the Vatican is quite scandalous at this time. It needs cleaning up almost as much as the issues of pedophilia and cover-up of pedophilia, and almost as much as the issue of the Inquisition. Because all those three things, and I write about this in my book on the Pope's War, the Inquisition has been brought back in the last 42 years with the last two popes. The Inquisition has been brought back. The Inquisition has been brought back. The Inquisition has been brought back. The financial situation is really scandalous. Just a year or so ago, the Italian government forbade Vatican credit cards to be cashed any place because there was a whole question of money laundering and all this. And this has been going on for a long time with the Vatican. The lack of transparency about finance. So, and then you have to understand that there's a real link in politics with the Vatican. I point out, for example, under Reagan, the CIA linked up with Pope John Paul II, and they attacked liberation theology-based communities in Latin America, and have really destroyed that whole movement as it was anyway, and replaced it with Opus Dei. Liberation, all of which are extreme right-wing groups that feed, right-wing values, if you will, or attitudes of power over, of domination, of patriarchy, and even of fascism, even of fascism, even of fascism, even of fascism. Over 105 theologians, I was just one of them, have been silenced or expelled or harassed, hounded, and in the last 42 years under Pope John Paul II and Benedict, and Benedict, when he was head of the Inquisition, he was head of the Inquisition, he was head of the Inquisition, he was head of the Inquisition. They changed the name. It's called the Sacred Doctrine of Faith, but it used to be called the Inquisition. And he led the charge against all of us theologians. And I missed the 105. By the way, there's several good Canadians. And that one of them dropped dead. He died of a heart attack when he was packing his bags for the 6th time to go to Rome to defend his theology. Even though the Second Vatican Council said that theologians were free to think, and there was such a thing as freedom of conscience for everyone. You see, that's what's really happened in the last 42 years, is that I think we've had 2 schismatic popes, because the popes and their curia have taken the real teachings of Vatican II, which were about Reformation in the church and new thinking and so forth, and linking to the gospel values of social justice. They've taken that and stuffed it. And that's what the silencing of 105 theologians means. So there's no question the Inquisition is back. The Inquisition is back. The Inquisition is back. The Inquisition is back. His actions were not that courageous under the military dictatorship of that Argentina went through in 1983 and so forth. And he's received a lot of criticism for that. Also, he has not backed liberation theology in base communities. He belongs to this group called Communion Liberation, which is a very right-wing group in Italy. It's compared to Opus Dei. They call it the Italian Opus Dei. And it claims to be lay-based, just like Opus Dei claims, but in fact it's run by clerics. And
just let me jump in for people that don't know. I'm going to say, correct me if I'm wrong, because I certainly have no expertise in this, but Opus Dei represents the far right of the Catholic Church in alliance with the far right of various ruling elites in different countries, and it's a kind of secret conspiratorial and usually up to rather dark and nefarious things.
Well, that's true. I have a whole chapter on them in my book on the Pope's War, and it's scary because they are so prominent in the Catholic Church today. They're appointing Opus Dei cardinals and bishops all over South America, and now in North America as well. And Escriva, who was a fascist Spanish priest who started Opus Dei, they rushed him into canonization faster than any saint in history, and they ignored all the people who were close to him, who saw his dark and shadow side, and his sexism, the fact that he praised Hitler. Let me say that again, he praised Hitler, and they tell us he's in heaven. I don't know what that means. But yeah, Opus Dei needs to be watched, and they're everywhere. They're very strong in the American media. They're very strong. They were very strong in the CIA and the FBI. The biggest spy in American history, who gave away more secrets than anyone, got more of our spies murdered than anyone else, is now in jail, I think for life, because he ran free in the FBI for 20 years and giving away all these secrets. Went to mass every day of the week, but meanwhile he was very treasonous. So Opus Dei is scary.
And you're saying Pope Francis is a member of something like Opus Dei. You're saying Pope Francis
he wasn't a member of Opus Dei.
No, something like it. You're saying
he was close to Communion Liberation. And they are another version that's close to Opus Dei. Opus Dei began in Spain. Communion Liberation is a more recent group. They began in Italy, and they are less secretive than Opus Dei. That's one reason we know he was part of it. I don't want to lock it down just to community liberation, but it is part of his history. I think the thing to watch is to see who he appoints as Secretary of State. The previous two Secretary of States are very shadowy people, and I can tell you some stories about them if you want to know. He's not been friendly. This is why community liberation is his path. There's a sentimental veneer to a lot of what the media is into today. And maybe they'll calm down. But remember what Carl Jung says, behind sentimentalism there lies violence. And so the sweetness is not enough. We have to see the actions and the real philosophy behind any movement and any individual that represents a movement, and not project too much onto any human being. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. The corruption the Vatican is in at this time in history is unparalleled unless you go back to the Borgias of the 16th century. The corruption the Vatican is in at this time in history is unparalleled unless you go back to the Borgias of the 16th century. The corruption the Vatican is in at this time in history is unparalleled unless you go back to the Borgias of the 16th century.